Hello and welcome. Today we are going to be playing Kerbal Space Program. This is a game, as the name suggests, that is based around space exploration. One of the nicest things about it is the physics is fairly spot on. It's not perfect due to floating point errors and the like, and sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself as usual. But it's pretty darn close. Now, as you saw, or maybe saw if you looked and were paying attention, focus is on Kerbal. This is not, and also if you could tell from the characters on the main screen, this is not our solar system. It's a fictional system. However, it was designed so that pretty much all the physics are similar to our system. There is a gas giant, there's the Earth, basically, and I actually left a rocket in orbit. I'm going to end that mission. So, there we go. Now, when we get back to actually playing, we'll have nothing in orbit. So anyway, I tried to make a video before, but ended up, Fraps was not being nice to me, and none of it got recorded. Anyway, I'm gonna load up the ship that I built. Well, actually, I think I'll start by showing you a few of the other things. So, in this game, you choose from, as you can see, a massive list of various parts, and you put them together to form a ship. This is one of the various ship designs. It looks like it's a very heavy lander due to the number of rockets and massive payload, not payload, but massive fuel. This this used to be my favorite lander until in my recordings that I tried to record anyway, I came up with my own lander, which I much prefer, to be honest. So, before we go anywhere, I want to name this thing and save it. Okay, so I'm unoriginal, so let's just call it something like Raven, I don't know. That's not really fitting for a rocket, that's more of a plain name. It's too bird-like. So let's call it Kerbal, even though it's completely irrelevant. No. I don't know, let's just call it the Razor. That works for me. I'm gonna save this because I'm quite proud of it and I don't really want to lose it. Anyway, let's zoom out and see the whole rocket. Alright, we are actually zoomed out as far as we can go, so as you can tell, this is quite a massive rocket. In here, this is actually a very large fairing. If I could touch things. Okay, something's going weird. Okay, there we go. As you can see, inside here is the inside here is my lander. It is fairly simple. There are some fuel tanks ready to lay out and a set of 3 just for some extra extra fuel. Anyway, there are some landing struts, there's a ladder so the astronaut can reach the ground, and there are fuel lines that feed the fuel inward. Moving on down the rocket, if we could put this back, there is also, whoops, that was the wrong thing. There we go. There's also a second stage, and right here this shroud is also a decoupler. It separates 2 stages of a rocket, so this part can detach from this part, and this part detaches from this part. But anyway, this stage is the interplanetary stage. It gets us from Kerbin, the planet's Earth, to wherever our destination is. And then finally there is the first stage, and that consists of a very large payload, or a very large fuel source, and some solid rocket boosters, or SRBs for short. These solid rocket boosters are attached around the sides with radial decouplers, so that basically they give it an extra kick right at launch to fight the incredible amount of gravity and atmosphere that dominates the first stage of getting a spaceship into orbit. At ground level is where gravity is the highest, and the atmospheric pressure, and thus wind resistance, is the highest. So, naturally, your bottommost stage needs to be the largest. There is a rocket equation that you can use to find out exactly how to stage these things, but I won't get into that this video. I might get into it in a later video, but for now, I'd just like to show off this game. It is a very, very, very... well, that's a fun game, sure. But aren't games supposed to be fun? So, it's not really saying much that a game is fun. But anyway, my point is, I'm in love with this game. It is incredible. I love it. Alright, what we're gonna do is, as you saw, I've already launched one of these, so I know of a small flaw in the overall design. Let's make sure that's the right stage. Yes, that is the right stage. Okay. These are miniature solid rocket boosters. They give us an extra kick once we separate this this stage from the rest of the top half of the rocket. The problem is this top half of the rocket is very massive, and we're also kicking off the upper shroud, because once we're in space, it's no longer necessary. It's just basically dead weight once we get into space. Once there's no more atmosphere, there's no use for aerodynamics. And so, because of that, this decoupler is supposed to kind of kick us outward away from the rest of the ship. But because equal and opposite reactions of this one firing off the outer shroud as well, we kind of sit still. So this is to try and give us a little kick, so that we don't end up kind of bumping into this and possibly destroying a part of our spaceship. That would be catastrophic. But anyway, we are going to go through a quick check of our staging, make sure everything is in order, which it is. Do a final save just to make sure our rocket design is saved, and launch. Okay, so this game is controlled with the WASD keys, WASD, and then Q and E to roll. Anybody who's any kind of familiar with avionics knows that there's pitch and yaw, but there's also, because of 3 dimensions, there is a roll as well. And so that's what the Q and E are for. But anyway, when we start launching, we're going to want to turn on our SAS, which is it's not really an autopilot per se, but it is a stabilizer. It stabilizes you. It's kind of automatically. That's why you see the pitch, yaw, and roll kind of freaking out here, because it's trying to stabilize, and it has no thrust which to use to attempt to stabilize. But anyway, when we fire the first stage, we are going to fire all our rockets and release this latch. And our stabilizer will keep us pointed straight up until we reach the magical height we want to. way because of the rotation of the Earth. And thus, that is the direction we are going to start rolling, tilting, I guess. Try not to have ambiguous terms here. We're going to want to start turning over towards the west. I think that's west. Anyway, it's right on the screen. So anyway, soon we'll be running out of fuel in these odd boosters, and we're going to jettison those in right now. Alright, so we are now a flat-up, arrowhead-looking rocket flying directly into space. And our altitude is approaching our desired height, and time to start rolling over. This is not my method of initiating an orbit, is not the most efficient, but with this rocket it works just right. Anyway, I point myself at the 45 and burn off the rest of my fuel. In this game, the atmosphere ends at 70 kilometers. And so we need to point our highest point of the orbit, our apoapsis, at over 70 meters. Otherwise, we will be aerobraking, meaning we will be fighting against wind resistance and slowing down, which will ultimately bring us back down out of an orbit. So anyway, the more efficient way, as I was saying, is to follow your prograde vector. This is the vector at which your momentum is traveling, and this is the vector at which you are pointed. And if you use your prograde vector and follow it, you will get the most actual acceleration out of your travels. So at this point we need to jettison this switch. Whoa! Forgot to turn that off. That threw us for a loop. We're spinning fairly bad. Ooh, this is not too pretty. Having that rocket firing as well really screwed us up. I forgot to throttle down between stages, and this is ridiculous. Okay, I'm gonna use the throttle vectoring on this thruster. Oh my gosh, this is insane. Come on. Okay, we have some relative control over the... Never mind. I lied. Okay. That is the absolute worst I have ever experienced with this rocket. That was some insane spin. To be honest, I probably should have instead used, or not used, but angled those SRBs so that they spiraled me. The spiraling is much preferable to the out-of-control twisting and turning around in circles. Anyway, it is now time to begin our orbital burn. What this does is takes our little suborbital hop and increases our velocity. If anybody knows how, or rather, if anyone doesn't know how orbiting works, you're basically falling so fast that you continually, in the right, just the right direction, that you continually miss the Earth even though it's pulling you towards it. And so you continue to spin around and around. And so what we gotta do is get up to that speed that it requires in order to continually miss the Earth. And that is, in this game, approximately 5,000, depending on your hut. Or maybe not. Must be 5,000 for a higher orbit. Anyway, need to increase this height just a little bit more, just to make sure we're not skipping into the atmosphere. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to perform a transfer orbit to this Earth, or this game's primary moon. There's actually another moon, a very tiny moon, in this game. And it is actually possibly even easier to get to than the first moon because of its really low gravity. And so landing and escaping from it is fairly easy. But anyway, the problem at this stage is it's very big and all of my rotational force is coming from this crew hatch. And that crew hatch is very small in comparison to the rest of the stage. It's somewhat unfortunate design choice, but it works nonetheless. It is entirely workable. It is a little more frustrating than I would like, but I can live with it. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to use a little bit of a cheat. Not a cheat so much, but a cheap tactic. In order to transfer orbits, which is how you get from one body to another in space, you need to calculate the exact angle at which you need to be, or you need to aim for, that you will be there at the exact time that the moon reaches there, and it's approximately this distance. Now, when you burn, you're actually increasing the opposite side of your, well, when you burn prograde, you're increasing the opposite side of your orbit, as you saw there with our increase from a suborbital hop to an actual stable orbit. And so we use that to increase one side of our orbit out until it intercepts with the moon, and we try to get caught by the moon. So, what we need to do is burn at just the right angle, or just the right time in our orbit around the Earth, or Kerbal. And so, there's a visual clue for just when the rocket actually is in the perfect position to do this orbital transfer. And that is just after the moon rises above the horizon of the Earth. I'm going to keep calling it Earth, and sometimes Kerbal, and sometimes Earth, simply because I'm not used to calling these things by their real name. Oh, nope, that's the sun. I thought it was the moon at first, but it's way too bright to be the moon. Anyway, we should be very close. Let's time warp a little bit higher. And there's the moon. Okay, we are very unfortunate to be pointed almost exactly the wrong way. I'm going to... This is not generally a good tactic to use, but I'm going to burn a little fuel to turn this thing around. So otherwise we are going to miss our mark. I'm using the F key to temporarily disable the stabilization unit in order to change my vector. And then when you release it, it re-enables the stabilization. So anyway, we're going to burn until this apoapsis intercepts the moon. And the further out it gets, the actually less fuel it takes to increase it even more. So we're going to want to throttle down because we do not want to overshoot. So we throttle slower and slower as we get closer and closer to our encounter with the moon. We're actually probably going to end up being a little bit behind. I mean ahead, not behind. Okay. Okay, we want our periaps to be fairly close. 99... 60. I feel like that's good enough. Okay, so now we just simply sit back and enjoy the ride. Now, I would advise you be very careful when time warping towards this. If you time warp too quick, you will shoot past it and miss completely. We have to do what is a retrograde burn, or burning in the opposite direction to kill our velocity in order to make sure we are captured by the moon and do not simply skip past it. Okay. In a second, this yellow is going to turn into the blue, and what's going to happen when that happens is it's going to show us our orbit relative to the moon. Currently, it's relative to Kerbal. This is the actual place we are going to pass by in Kerbal, relative to Kerbal, but as you can see, it jumps to this way. But when we actually reach this point, the moon will be all the way over here, as we saw before. But anyway, right now, there's literally nothing to do but wait until we reach periaps. And since we are pointed once again the exact opposite direction we need to be pointed, I'm going to stop early for the sole reason to reorient ourselves in the opposite direction. Now, unfortunately, I think our inclination is a little bit, yeah, it's quite off. We are quite inclined. However, I think we can very much fix this by simply landing at the right point. Now, this is important for one little thing: returning back to Earth. When we return to Earth, we want to be on relatively the same orbital path as the Earth. So, we will time warp very carefully towards periaps. Now there's a nice little time indicator here, so you can help yourself not to skip past it. It's a little bit difficult to keep the cursor over it while also trying to hold your finger over the time warp buttons, but we're approaching, and hot mess, I have drifted way off my vector. It is going to take about oh, that's a minute and 19. Okay, it's not going to take me that long. However, it is kind of going to take me a little while. Okay. Okay. Wow, it did take me a good bit of time. Okay, we are approaching 20 seconds, 10 seconds. Alright. It is now time to begin burning, and this will reduce the size of the opposite end of our orbit, thus putting us in a safe orbit around the moon. And now, typically we would wait until we have a good location to land at, but I want to land on the light side of the moon, which means we're just going to keep burning until we have a good landing point on this side of the moon. Alright. I'm good with that spot. It leaves us roughly near the equator, the equator of the moon, which is good for taking back off. Okay. We have very little fuel left in this stage, so I think I'm just going to jettison it entirely. I have more than enough fuel in my lander. I wish these solid rocket boosters weren't still listed in this stage. It's kind of annoying. Anyway, we are kind of just waiting. I'll time warp a bit. Okay, I want to get roughly around 20-something thousand meters. Okay, we're coming in rather quickly. However, this stage is very powerful and it's very nice. Like I said, I'm quite proud of it. We might as well lower the struts now, so that we don't forget later in the heat of trying to make sure we don't crash into the side of the planet. The moon. It's not a planet. Anyway, we're going to burn exactly retrograde, because that is the most fuel-efficient way to land this thing. So we're going to try to very slowly bleed off this velocity. We don't want to bleed it all off now, because then we'll just end up having to accelerate again to get back down. If we have no velocity, then of course we're not getting any closer to the moon. And this velocity is relative to the moon, by the way. Okay, we need to make sure we follow this vector to get the absolute best fuel efficiency. And this is actually kind of a boring part to watch. I really don't have anything to say about this. The first time you do this, it is incredibly stressful. You have to kind of guess at what you're doing. It's hard. You will probably crash the first time, unfortunately, as that is. There, the solid rocket fuel boosters went away. Okay, we're under 10,000 kilometers. 10,000 kilometers. 10,000 meters. So, it's time to start getting a little bit more serious about bleeding off this velocity. Not too much, because we have a very powerful engine that can bleed it off really quickly. As you can see, we're not even using 50% of this thing's total thrust yet. I mean, we can barely thrust and still reduce our velocity. Plus, we can't even see the surface of the moon yet. Okay. Now we can. As you can see, we're starting to be able to see these rocks on the surface. And so, coming in slowly, follow that thrust, that vector. Now this is by no means going to be a perfect perfect landing. We're simply, because attempting to do both at the same time and reach zero at the same moment you actually reach the ground is very difficult to do. So what I'm doing at this point is trying to get my absolute velocity pointed straight down, because I want to land this thing straight up and down, not sideways or slantways or whatever ways you can think of. Okay. We should soon be able to see some sort of shadow. So far that is not true, so we have quite a ways to go. Since that being the case, we have quite a ways to go before we actually touch down on the Earth. I mean, the Earth. The Moon. As soon as we see a shadow. We should... Okay, there's a shadow. Time to start really bleeding off the rest of that velocity. Not too much, because you don't want to actually start going upwards. But you definitely don't want to hit anything beyond about 12 meters per second. Ideally, you would like to hit as slowly as possible, because having some additional velocity, while it is pretty much inevitable that you'll have some sort of velocity when hitting down, when touching down, the most you can reduce that, the better. And that is actually probably my cleanest landing ever in this game. Most often I will bounce off the surface with slowly killing off velocity with a bounce, because a lot of times I end up with something like 7 meters per second laterally. So I'm actually flying off to the side at 7 meters per second, which is plenty slow enough that the impact doesn't actually harm the ship in any way. It just takes a little bit extra time and an extra stress to land. Anyway, that is just about it for this episode. It is quite a long one, in fact. So, I will see you next time with the return trip. I might actually even cut this one in half. You'll obviously know by that point. Anyway, until next time.